The Light. October 2017. International organ of the Center for the Worldwide Ahmadiyya Anjuman Ishat Islam. Popularly known as the Lahore Ahmadiyya Movement. The only Islamic organization upholding the finality of prophethood. Webcasting on the world's first real-time Islamic service at www.virtualmosque.co.uk. Content. The Call of the Messiah. A Most Excellent Goal for Muslims by Hazrat Maulana Muhammad Ali. Jamal al-Banna's Approach to the Quran by H. Zachariah. Muslims built the Wailing Wall for the Jews by F. M. Lowenberg. Jewish Magic by Shahid Aziz M. Sc. End of content. The Call of the Messiah. By Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. The Promised Messiah and Mahdi. Truth underlying the principles of Islam. The Holy Quran teaches us that the person of God is free from every fault and defect, and that he wishes that human beings should, by following his injunctions, also become free from every defect and be purified of every impurity. Thus, he says, and whoever is blind in this world, he will be blind in the hereafter, and further away from the path. The Holy Quran 17:72. 4. The truth is that the eyes to see God are granted in this world, and anyone who leaves this world without getting the eyes to see God, shall not see God in the next life. In this verse Almighty God has given us clearly to understand to what height of spiritual advancement He wants man to reach, and the stage of perfection a man can attain by following His commandments. How Almighty God can be seen in this very world, is then stated in the Holy Quran. Thus, it says, whoever hopes to meet his Lord, he should do good deeds, and join no one in the service of his Lord, shirk. The Holy Quran 18-110. The first portion of this verse requires a man to do good deeds. That is, virtuous deeds free from impurity and every contamination, by which are meant deeds which are neither done that they may be seen by others, nor do they generate vanity in the heart of a man that he is the doer of such great and excellent deeds, nor are they incomplete or defective, nor do they savor of aught but sincere personal love entertained towards God, and are saturated with true faithfulness and perseverance. The second portion of the verse requires a man to abstain from shirk, such as setting up with God such false deities as the sun, the moon, the stars of heaven, the physical forces of nature, the elements, or anything else that is upon earth or the heavens. It includes setting too high a value upon the physical means and placing so much reliance on them as to consider them actually effective without any reservation, like God Himself. Or, giving an overriding importance to one's own resources and efforts, for this too is a sort of shirk. On the other hand, when a man has done everything that lies in his power and exercised his abilities to his best, he should still be conscious of his utter weakness and ignorance, and ascribe everything to the mighty power and deep knowledge of God and not to his own power or learning. Our soul should constantly be in a state of perfect submission and prostration at the divine threshold, and thus draw His favors and blessings. Unless we make our condition like the helpless cripple who, lying in a desert parched with thirst, suddenly sees a spring of sweet and clear water, and halting and limping takes himself to it, and applies his burning lips to cool water, not parting them until he is satiated, I say, unless we fully realize our own utter weakness and inability and the mighty power and beneficent grace of God which we constantly draw upon, we are not free from shirk and do not deserve to be called Unitarians. End of extract from Lecture Lahore, pages 7-8. Next article. A Most Excellent Goal for Muslims. A Friday sermon by Hazrat Maulana Muhammad Ali. Delivered on June 4, 1920. Translated by Dr. Muhammad Ahmad. President UAI Ohio. Surely Allah has bought from the believers their persons and their property, theirs, in return, is the garden. They fight in Allah's way, so they slay and are slain. It is a promise which is binding on him in the Torah and the Gospel and the Quran. and who is more faithful to his promise than Allah. Rejoice therefore in your bargain which you have made. And that is the mighty achievement. The Holy Quran 9-111. The contract between Allah and the believers. This promise is like a contract for buying and selling property and therefore binding upon Allah the Most Exalted. It is recognized by the Torah, the Gospel and the Holy Quran. Who is more truthful than Allah the Most Exalted in keeping his promise? Those who make this promise with Allah should rejoice, for this deal means a great success for them. One wonders how many Muslims sacrifice their property and person and achieve this great success. How many truly understand and believe in it? Selling something means you no longer have any control over it and someone else is the owner. Allah the Most Exalted calls giving up ownership of one's life and property a mighty achievement. People think that saving and not giving means success, but the universal message of Islam does not measure success by our possessions. Nor does it say that reciting the prayer, fasting during the month of Ramadan, performing the pilgrimage or paying the poor rate is the most excellent accomplishment. Islam demands much more from Muslims. Selling or sacrifice of one's property and life seems to be a very lofty goal. When we sell something and somebody else buys it, we no longer have any entitlement to it. How many of us meet this standard of belief that all we have belongs to Allah? Selling one's life means using our time, faculties and strength to measure up to this standard. People generally understand the meaning of spending of one's wealth in Allah's way. Islam, by asking the believers to sacrifice both their person and property, has gone a step further and set up a very excellent goal for Muslims. A nation cannot make progress unless it has a great purpose in front of it. Higher goal. The nations who set small goals cannot reach the highest level of progress. Only those nations who have a higher goal in front of them rise above the rest. If there is a mountain in front of a man and he is determined to scale it at his disposal, he will certainly be able to accomplish this to some degree. An individual who is looking for the easy way out does not attempt to climb the mountain. To sell one's property and person in God's way is truly an excellent goal that Islam has put before Muslims. In fact, if we reflect, we realize that our life and property do not belong to us. God is the real owner, so we are not doing him a favor by returning it to him, for Allah the Most Exalted states, "Surely Allah has bought from the believers their persons and their property." The Holy Quran 9-111. The meaning of this statement is the believer no longer has authority over them. He no longer has the right to command his faculties to do this or not to do that. He must accept Allah's authority over all and to use them in accordance with his will and commandment. This is the greater goal Islam places before Muslims. If a goal is lofty but cannot be put into practice, it cannot be of benefit to man. There are many excellent teachings that are not practical and only appear to be attractive. Their objective, despite being great, is impracticable. The companions of the Holy Prophet, by sacrificing their lives and properties in Allah's way, have demonstrated that the teachings of Islam and their objective are within the limits of practicability. They showed us how one can sell his person and property. Loftier the goal, greater the purpose. I want to illustrate the importance of a goal or purpose with another example. The Christian doctrine tells us that God cannot be merciful without being just, or the justice of God demands punishment unless one believes in the atonement of Jesus Christ. If God cannot be merciful without requiring something in exchange, how can unconditional feelings of mercy become a part of human character? The objective of the believer in this doctrine is therefore greatly diminished. On the other hand, the very first sentence of the Holy Quran is, "In the name of Allah the Beneficent, the Merciful." It tells us of the beneficence of God, his giving without asking anything in exchange. The purpose of describing God's attributes is for humans to benefit from them and to produce in their character Allah's attributes, as the Holy Prophet's hadith states. Create Allah's morals within you. What would be the source of mercy of a nation that describes its God as being incapable of mercy without exchange? If this is the standard of achievement, No matter how hard someone may try, their character would fail to improve. Because of attributing inability to be merciful without exchange to God, unconditional mercy fails to evolve in the national conscience of those who profess this doctrine. Mercy does not mean treating your strong foe mercifully, for one who has the power is also capable of enforcing it. The time to be merciful is when the opponent is weak and vanquished and has lost the strength to acquire anything. Now take the example of the European nations. You will find one principle in common. Although they have reached the highest standard of the teachings of Christianity, their shared goal is to give to someone who has power and crush the one who is without it. What could be a more glaring example of failure of the teachings of Christianity? After a war lasting 5 years, the victors are not willing to show even a shred of mercy towards the vanquished. This may seem to be a victory, but in fact is a great moral defeat. Trust of Allah. By telling the Muslims they have given up their persons and properties for His sake, Allah the Most Exalted is pointing out that these things do not belong to them. In fact, they belong to Allah and have been given to us as a trust. We are only its trustees. It would be rather strange that we continue to benefit from them, but when He who is the owner of this trust demands their return, we are unwilling to return them to Him. Can a trustee refuse to return what has been given to him for safekeeping? Is it his right to spend out of it on his personal needs, but when directed by the owner to give some in charity, his heart feels straitened and he is reluctant to give? Remember that God is the real owner. If you believe in the word of God and want to be counted amongst the believers, ponder upon this. Your condition is that of a very dishonest person. Self-reformation. Muslims today want success without facing any hardship. They are, however, not willing to give back to Allah what He has placed under their guardianship to achieve this goal. People want to enter paradise without spending a penny in Allah's way. They complain about the dealings of others but fail to reform their own. I accept that you should make a full effort to demand your rights. The civilized world today is unwilling to give anything unless they are confronted by show of power. To generate such strength, self-reformation is essential. Why is the attention of the nation not drawn towards this in our conventions and councils? True character cannot be generated in this way. We are happy to listen when others are ill spoken of, but when attention is drawn towards our own reformation, we deem it as rubbish. Muslims should be exemplars for the rest of the world. Their morals should have the coloring of the divine. That is why Allah the Most Exalted says, "Surely Allah has bought from the believers their persons and their property." The Holy Quran 9-111. What right do they have to discard Allah's commandments and use their faculties and strengths as they desire? In one way, however, this usage can be justified as spending in Allah's way. It is narrated in the Hadith, the person who for the sake of Allah puts a mouthful to feed his wife, it becomes charity on his part. All that is spent in Allah's way or with the intent to spend in accordance with His will is for Him. Spend for your next of kin, but the intent should be obedience to the command of Allah the Most Exalted. Such expenditure for the betterment of humanity becomes for Allah. If somebody spends to eat what is lawful or to buy clothes for personal adornment as part of God's commandment, it also becomes spending in Allah's way. Spending for one's children to fulfill their rights also falls under this category. Intent, passion, and deeds. Intentional spending is not merely hypothetical. It is manifested through a person's deeds. The intensity of passion with which one spends when a family member is in distress should be like spending when the religion needs it. Unless such sentiment is generated in the heart, it is to be as some the desired spiritual change to which Allah's word calls has not yet come. In short, a believer should understand that his wealth is not his but belongs to Allah. It has been given to him to spend in His way when needed. For example, a person cannot be called wise if he is ill and needs to see a physician but fails to spend for this purpose. Our religion is in great peril. If we do not find it in our hearts to spend for its cause, we will regret like the patient who destroys his well-being by not spending to find a cure for his illness. Similarly, The person who does not fulfill the trust of Allah in time of need will regret. Role of the Ahmadiyya movement. For a person who considers Islam to be true and has the farsightedness to take the pledge of the Ahmadiyya movement to keep religion above the world, it is not hard to understand. He must firmly accept the principle that all we have is for Allah the Most Exalted and we are only its custodians. The one in real need should be given priority. Allah the Most Exalted made a man stand up for this purpose and through revelation drew his attention towards recognition of the real malady affecting the Muslims. It should be ample proof to recognize the divine origin of his mission that he is commanded to only take the pledge of keeping religion above the world from his followers. In fact, it is the only remedy to cure this illness. Allah the Most Exalted wants for this organization to set an example. Why do you want to act on the contrary? Keep your responsibilities in focus. The principle of keeping the religion above the world firmly re-establishes you on this Quranic principle. Surely Allah has bought from the believers their persons and their property. The Holy Quran 9-111. How can you spread the teachings of the promised Messiah when you fail to act upon them? It is like the blind leading the blind. I am therefore exhorting members of our small organization to make a firm commitment in their hearts that in time of need they will readily sacrifice their life and property in Allah's way. You have already struck a bargain with God that when needed we will be happier using our wealth and faculties for the cause of religion. This feeling of joy is more than the pleasure we get out of spending for our own needs. No doubt this commitment appears very difficult. Trade and traffic are a source of great attraction and become an impediment in sincerely spending one's person and property in God's way. Prayers for advancement of religious knowledge. I offer you a remedy for this. You ought to generate this strength within you through prayer. Supplicate with humility before God to give you the strength to stay firm in your commitment. We read in the Holy Quran, and your Lord says, "Pray to me, I will answer you." The Holy Quran 40:60, whosoever attempts to get closer to him, he comes to his succor and gives him strength. Our prayers for worldly benefits may not gain acceptance, but Allah the Most Exalted does not let go to waste prayers for advancing religious knowledge and striving for this purpose. The Holy Quran states, "And those who strive hard for us, we shall certainly guide them in our ways. And Allah is surely with the doers of good." The Holy Quran 29:69. This is a promise of certainty. Remain sincere in your purpose. Allah the Most Exalted will give you strength. The precondition is to be passionate and humble in your prayers. If you thus supplicate before Allah, you will get the strength that allows you to make all these sacrifices. This kind of passion rises in the heart when finding oneself in distress. The soul cries out for help from God. I am asking you to be passionate in your prayers. The last 10 days of Ramadan are upon us. Strengthen these prayers with your deeds so that your example serves to guide others. Make it binding upon you to get up in the early part of the night. Cry before Allah the Most Exalted to deliver Islam from its state of abasement that its enemies want for it and make it successful. Also pray for your own reformation. Ask Him with humility to generate love for Islam, God and His Messenger in our hearts and the hearts of our friends. This love and passion for service of Islam should be above all. We should have such spirit of sacrifice for Islam that we are pleased to sacrifice all for it. Beseech Him to remain united in love and harmony and be subservient to all His commands. Also admit that you have been remiss in your responsibility. End of article. Next article. Jamal al-Banna's approach to studying the Quranic text and its effects on Islamic legal rulings, a critical analytical study part 1. By Dr. Habibullah Zakaria. International Islamic University, Malaysia. Note: this article is reproduced with the kind permission of the author from the International Journal of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Volume 2, Issue 6. July 2017, www.ijaz.com, with minimal editing. We are serializing it here in 2 parts. Gamal al-Banna or Jamal al-Banna, from 1920 to 2013, was an Egyptian author and trade unionist and was the youngest brother of Hassan al-Banna, from 1906 to 1949, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Lahore Ahmadiyya movement concurs in general with the principles outlined in the article, but does not necessarily draw the same conclusions in detail as Gamal al-Banna. Abstract. There are many different approaches employed by scholars in studying the Noble Quran, both in the ancient time and this era, between extremism and moderation, and between lenience and coarseness. This research paper aims to crystallize the points of view of Jamal al-Banna and his proposed approaches to studying the Noble Quran as a divine text, in addition to unveiling his stance towards strenuous efforts and continual contributions made by scholars who are interested in studying the Quran and its sciences. The study also inquires whether the approach proposed by Jamal al-Banna for studying the Quran can be considered in the present time. It also inquires whether it has certain implications on the deduction of Sharia rulings. This paper will follow both analytical and critical approaches in studying the significance of al-Banna's approach, especially its discussion in the light of the scientific principles approved by scholars. The study concludes with some findings and fruitful suggestions that can enrich the library in general and the Islamic legacy. A brief overview of Jamal al-Banna and his intellectual origin. The birth of Jamal al-Banna is traced to December 1920, in a region called Ahmadiyya, the Bahari Governorate of Egypt. Al-Banna belonged to a renowned family with some outstanding contributions towards the service of Islam and its noble teachings. His father was a prominent scholar who authored the biggest encyclopedia of 24 volumes on the hadiths from the book titled Musnad Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal al-Shaybani. His elder sibling is Imam Hassan Banna, the founder of Islamic Brotherhood. Jamal al-Banna completed his primary and secondary education. However, due to a quarrel between him and an English teacher, he decided to leave the school's systematic study and began to read books to educate himself in some scientific fields until he became the famous personality to whom reference was made. Since al-Banna was nurtured in a well-civilized and educated Muslim family, the impact of this environment became apparent in his great love for reading to the extent that it became his hobby. He loved reading very much. However, this is not surprising because his father's library contained a huge amount of Islamic culture sources in addition to literature books and educational journals. Jamal is regarded one of the most prolific Islamic thinkers, for he authored more than 100 books. His first book, titled 3 Obstacles in the Way to Glory, was written in 1945. In 1946, he authored another book titled A New Democracy. It should be noted that al-Banna's writings are not confined to the Islamic thought, but they cover some other aspects like Quranic studies, jurisprudence issues, political and economic issues and so forth. Jamal al-Banna died on Wednesday, January 30, 2013 at the age of 93 at Agricultural Hospital in Docky after suffering from sickness. 2. Characteristic features of Jamal al-Banna's approach to studying the Quran. Before discussing the methodological principles adopted by Jamal al-Banna in studying the Quran or the Quranic discourse, it is worth to prepare a prelude that will explain his method as it is. This seems to be an important matter to be aware of for a better understanding of his approach to understanding the Quranic discourse. According to al-Banna, the overall view of the Quranic discourse is regarded as a fundamental pillar. So, any imbalance that arises during employing this view is considered heinous crime against the Quran. Giving the exegesis of one verse after the other without a reliance on the governing values and the themes under discussion prevents the understanding of the meaning and the intention of the Quran. He said, interpretation of the Quran one verse after the other implies cutting off its connections, preventing it from reaching its whole meaning as well as the effectiveness of its guidance that results from the cohesion between one verse and another. Moreover, it inculcates in minds an attitude which lessens the effectiveness of the Quranic discourse. With this understanding, we can debrief his approach employed for understanding the Quranic discourse, which has its impacts on his deduction of Sharia rulings. Hence, the following are the most important part of this approach. 3. First, making intellectual the basis for understanding the Quranic discourse. No one with knowledge of Sharia and its intents will doubt as to the outstanding roles played by the intellect in Islam. Indeed, Islam honors intellect by making it the determinant of onus. Despite the status enjoyed by intellect, Al-Bani goes further to see the necessity of prioritizing intellect on the Quranic text, since the latter is only a confirmation of the former. However, giving the Quran priority over the intellect is regarded an act contrary to the Quran itself. This is because the Quran prioritizes the intellect. To implement the Quran, it is necessary to make use of reason for its understanding, because the style of Quran can suggest more than one meaning. Al-Banna confirms once again that, whatever is related to Sharia is supposed to be in agreement with the intellect first, then the revelation is only its confirmation and complement. This makes rationality an Islamic reference with regard to Sharia. In his opinion, intellect is an important tool which can eliminate the application of the Quranic text when it sees no point in that application. He said, the use of intellect can end up suspending the application of the Quranic text or stopping it if the reasons that led to it have ended, or as they say, negation of ruling due to the absence of its reason, or the rise of ruling due to the rise of its reason, or lack of ruling due to lack of its reason. Nothing like this is clearer an indication that human reason is given priority over the Quranic text, and that its implementation is necessary while dealing with the Quran. This is what the Prophet, SAW, did, and even Omar in his well-known analogical deductions, and what the companions tacitly approved of in his deeds. 4. Second, referring to the Quran directly. It is obvious that interpretation of the Quran is given by scholars using different styles. It can be the interpretation of the Quran by the Quran, interpretation of the Quran by the Hadith, interpretation of the Quran by sayings of companions, and interpretation of the Quran by sayings of predecessors. All these kinds of Quranic interpretation are the ones considered by the pioneers of Quranic exegesis, who advocate the conveyance of the Quranic meaning with the help of texts. On the other hand, scholars have made permissible the interpretation of Quran with the help of praiseworthy views. However, Jamal Banu emphasizes in many occasions that the interpretation which serves the spirit of the Quran, and capable enough to achieve the exact meaning it portrays, is the interpretation of the Quran by the Quran without resorting to any other texts. He said, the only Quranic interpretation that is reliable and free of defects is the act of interpreting the Quran by the Quran. Whatever is explained briefly in one passage will be explained in detail in another. And whatever appears obscure somewhere will be made evident elsewhere. He opines that the helping factor which plays a huge role in explaining the meanings of the Quran is to consider the context. He said, context is the greatest interpreter of the Quran. At this juncture, it is justifiable to say that it is very wrong to interpret a verse without knowing what is before and what is after. It must be interpreted with the context put in consideration. All this is in the Quran itself, so there is no need for an external interpreter. In this regard, a fierce attack is launched against the Quranic exegetes and jurists, for they, according to his view, have conveyed the Quranic texts in a way contrary to what it intends. At this point, Al-Banna contends that the interpretation given by exegetes and rulings deduced by jurists narrow down the broadness of the Quran, make difficult what has been simplified, make rigid what is flexible, and reject what is made permissible by its miraculous wording. This happened because the tyrannical spirit of the ancient era, the ignorance that permeated its atmosphere as well as widespread oppression at that time, did not allow freedom, equality and exposure that the Quran advocates. Today, we are bringing back to Islam its strength and effectiveness by returning to the Quran directly without being restricted by the interpretation of the interpreters, or the jurisprudence of jurists. While scholars are subjected to a harsh campaign, it has been somewhat tempered when the discrepancy between the Quranic texts and their jurisprudence is remitted to a jurisprudence influenced by the environment of jurist and his society. He stated as thus: jurisprudence of scholars has to be influenced by their era and the general climate, with no immunity from human shortcomings. This is an act of taming the Quran to cohere with their jurisprudence despite the incompatibility of the latter with the spirit of the former and its text. This prevents the embarrassment of relying on narrations and warding off pretexts. In this regard, it becomes obvious that a better understanding of the Quran entails a lack of reliance on the ancient interpretations. This is because these interpretations have prevented the understanding of the exact meanings intended by the Quran by imposing themselves as intermediary between the Quran and the reader. Such as the interpretation of Tabari, Ibn Kathir, Razi and Qurtubi and even Dil written by Sayyid Qutb. The third, lack of consideration for abrogation al-naskh in the Quran. Jamal al-Banna contends in many of his works that the issue of abrogation, on which many books were written by ancient scholars of Quranic exegetes, has driven them away from the true spirit of the Quran and its intended meanings. According to him, the case of abrogation is misguiding. He goes on and states, there is nothing worse in indication than what jurists refer to as abrogation, with which they call for the obstruction and solidification of hundreds of verses. Al-Banna specified a chapter that is not less than 70 pages for the issue of abrogation in his book titled, Al-Azlan al-Adhiman, in which he gives a lengthy discussion. He concludes claiming that abrogation is never a Quranic method to which one can be submissive or to which one can make reference. He refutes the claim for the existence of abrogation in the Quran by pointing out that the focus of scholars on two verses in the Quran whose apparent meaning indicates the presence of abrogation does not support their claim at all. The first is the verse 106 of chapter 2, while the second is the verse 101 of chapter 16. The verse in the Quranic discourse is not in the sense of text, but as miracle, presumption or indication. Fourth, lack of attention to the occasions of revelation. Al-Banna stresses that the understanding of the Quranic discourse should not be related to what the scholars of interpretation call occasions of revelation, as Bab al-Nuzul. He points out that most of the narrations about occasions of revelation are either distorted or fabricated, or narrated with the meaning that could be derived for another purpose. However, exegetes grabbed these hadiths because they offer solution to their problems, even though they say, consideration is given to a general meaning of words and not to the specific reason. To be continued in the next issue. Editor. End of first installment. Next article. Did Muslims build Judaism's holiest site? By F. M. Low Anberg. Middle East Quarterly Fall 2017. F. M. Lowenberg is Professor Emeritus at Bar Ilan University's School of Social Work. Since his retirement, his research interests have focused on the history of the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. Note: this research had been substantially edited to show that Muslims supported the Jews on many occasions. The full article can be found on www.meforum.org web link. The title of the original article is the Western Wall Judaism's Holiest Site? Editor. Once the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its official state religion in the 4th century, the situation of Jerusalem's Jewish community became precarious. During most of the next 300 years, Jews were not permitted to live or visit Jerusalem, but there were periods when this anti-Jewish policy was relaxed, and Jews were permitted to live in or visit the city. Yet there are no records of Jews praying at the Western Wall during those years. After the Persian and Arab conquests of the city in the 7th century, Jews were again allowed to reside in Jerusalem. They chose to live on Mount Zion, where they had a number of synagogues. They even had a synagogue on the Temple Mount, but no prayer services were conducted at the Western Wall. Early in the 14th century, Jews were barred from entering the Temple Mount by the Mamluks, who ruled Jerusalem from 1250 to 1516. Suleiman the Magnificent ordered improvements, including clearing an area around the western side of the retaining wall that contained the Temple Mount, which he assigned to the Jews as a place for them to pray. Before that, today's Western Wall held no religious significance. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire captured the city of Jerusalem, bringing to an end almost 300 years of Mameluke rule. Sultan Suleiman I the Magnificent, whose reign from 1520 until his death in 1566 was the longest reign of any Ottoman ruler, was among the most prominent monarchs of his day. He conquered many Christian strongholds in Europe and was stopped only in 1529 when he failed to conquer Vienna. He subsequently turned his attention toward consolidating his gains in the Middle East. In 1536, he ordered the restoration of Jerusalem's city walls, which had been in ruin since the 13th century. Later, he undertook an extensive renovation of the Dome of the Rock. Suleiman adopted a positive attitude toward the Jews of his realm. He persuaded many who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal a generation earlier to settle in Jerusalem. Some believe that he encouraged Jewish immigration in order to limit the influence of the local Arabic-speaking population. Whatever his motives, Jerusalem's Jews benefited from his benevolence toward them. 14 years after he had ordered the rebuilding of the city walls, Suleiman instructed his court architect to prepare the area that came to be known as the Western Wall as a place for Jewish worship. Such a move became possible because on January 14, 1546, a severe earthquake hit the region. Hundreds of people were killed. The flow of the Jordan River was stopped for 2 days by a landslide. A tsunami battered the Mediterranean coast from Acre to Gaza. The area hardest hit by this earthquake in Jerusalem was the Temple Mount and the quarters surrounding it, including many of the houses that had been built along the Western Wall. These were the houses that had prevented access to most of the Western Wall. Now that the approach was blocked by ruins rather than by houses occupied by many people, Suleiman felt ready to instruct his engineers to clear the ruins and to prepare a Jewish prayer site at the Western Wall. Once the Western Wall had been properly prepared as a prayer site, Suleiman issued a firman, which means a decree that established the right of Jews to pray there for all times. There are those who claim that this royal decree was issued to compensate the Jews for relinquishing their legal rights to pray on the Temple Mount, but there is no record that Jews ever relinquished those rights voluntarily. This firman was still in effect in the 19th century. In 1840, Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt, who was also the governor of Jerusalem, allowed the Jews to pay visits to the Western Wall, as of old, but forbade them to pave the area in front of it and cautioned them against raising their voices and displaying their books there. Subsequent governors reissued this firman in 1841, 1889, 1893 and 1909. The 19th century geographer Joseph Schwartz noted the importance of this decree even in his days. 300 years later, no one is molested by the Mohammedans, as we have a very old firman from the Sultan of Constantinople that the approach to the Western Wall shall not be denied to us, though the Porte, the Ottoman government, obtains for this privilege a special tax, which is, however, quite insignificant. Although Sultan Suleiman designated the Western Wall as a central locus of Jewish prayer, for more than 400 years, this site was quite unlike the Western Wall that we know today. From the time of its inception in the 16th century until 1967, the site was only a narrow alley. On one side were the houses of the thickly settled Arab neighborhood known as the Maghrabi Quarter and, on the other, the retaining Western Wall of the Temple Mount. The prayer area was only 4 meters wide and 28 meters long, occupying less than 6% of the Western Wall's total length of 488 meters. This small area could barely accommodate a few hundred people. End of article. Next article. Jewish Magic. By Shahid Aziz MSc. Since the time that Constantine embraced Christianity, Christians have persecuted the Jewish people. As the article about the Wailing Wall, printed in this issue of the Light shows, Suleiman, the Magnificent, helped the Jews escape Christian persecution in Portugal and Spain and settled them in Jerusalem. Martin Luther is regarded as a great reformer of Catholicism, but his statements about the Jews are full of hatred and are extremely poisonous. One reason for this persecution is obvious. The Jews had beaten, humiliated and eventually put on the cross the person Christians believe to be the Son of God. But there may have been another reason for such persecution. One difference between Islam and Judaism, and Christianity is that whereas Islam and Judaism stress following the law, Christians believe that this is not necessary. Jewish law commands the Jews to wash their hands before eating. It requires clean food is eaten and, generally stresses personal hygiene. In ancient times, the germ theory and sterilization was unknown. As late as 1960s, even the staff who prepared and served food did not wash their hands before touching food. So, when the Christians fell victims to waterborne cholera and other diseases caused by poor hygiene and were dying like flies, the Jews did not suffer. Jews themselves did not understand the reason and that it was washing that kept them alive. Christians assumed that if they were dying and Jews were not, the Jews must have poisoned their wells or used a magic spell to kill them. Jews, unaware that it was the result of following religious law which sterilized them, were unable to explain. In the Middle Ages, the European poor used every part of a slaughtered animal. This included blood, which went, and still does go, to make blood sausage. Jews made sure that all the blood was drained from a carcass before eating the meat. Christians could not believe that the Jews were throwing away nourishing food or feeding it to animals. This led them to assume that the Jews conducted gruesome blood rituals, which made Christians fall ill and die. Many countries brought in laws to prevent Jews from being farmers or craftsmen or soldiers. This forced them into finance instead. As many outbreaks are associated with animals and farming, this meant that Jews were less prone to epidemics. Even now, when some illness is found on a farm, movement of animals and humans to that farm is stopped. This led to greater suspicion of them. End of article.